Imagine waking each morning not to the warmth of sunlight, but to the cold green glow of ancient technologies humming with power that predates your species by millions of years. Imagine your earliest memories are not of a mother's embrace, but of skeletal metal fingers carefully adjusting your cradle, moving with a precision that speaks of calculations rather than care. Imagine growing up surrounded not by laughter and tears, but by the eternal silence of beings who have forgotten what it means to feel either emotion. This is what it means to be human, raised by Necrons, and the reality of such an existence is more alien, more isolating, and more transformative than you could possibly comprehend. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates that some might consider worse than death. To be raised from infancy by the ancient mechanical xenos known as Necrons represents one such fate, a twisted experiment in biology and culture that defies everything the Imperium of man holds sacred. You would be neither fully human nor remotely Necron, caught in a liminal space between the warm chaos of organic life and the cold order of deathless machines. Your entire worldview, your understanding of existence itself, would be shaped by beings who traded their souls for immortality 60 million years ago and have spent the eons since questioning whether they made the right choice. To understand what this existence would truly entail, we must first journey into the nature of the Necrons themselves, these ancient beings who once walked as flesh and blood under the name Necrontyre, before they made a bargain that would doom them to an eternity of hollow existence. We must explore the vast tomb complexes they inhabit, buried beneath worlds that might not even know they sleep there. We must examine their culture, their hierarchy, their psychology, and their peculiar relationship with the concept of life itself. Only then can we begin to comprehend what it would mean for a human child to be raised within such an environment, shaped by minds that have witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, yet have forgotten the simple pleasure of drawing breath. The Necrons are not conquerors in the traditional sense, though they seek to reclaim the galaxy they once ruled. They are not simply destroyers, though death follows in their wake. They are beings trapped between godhood and annihilation, possessing technology that would make them appear as gods to lesser species, yet lacking the very essence of what makes life worth living. They are immortal, but they cannot die peacefully. They are powerful beyond measure, but they have lost the capacity to truly enjoy that power. They remember being alive, but those memories fade with each passing millennium, like photographs left too long in the sun. And in this state of eternal paradox, some among them look upon the younger races with an emotion that might, in a being still capable of complex feelings, be called envy. The Necrontyre, as they were once known, were a species cursed from the moment of their birth. Their homeworld orbited a star that bathed them in radiation so intense that cancer and mutation were not aberrations, but the expected course of life. Their existence was brief and agonizing, their bodies failing them before they could accomplish great works or leave lasting legacies. They built monuments to death because death was the only constant in their lives. They created vast necropolises because they spent more time thinking about dying than about living. And when they finally escaped their cursed star and spread across the galaxy, they found a universe ruled by beings called the Old Ones, ancient and powerful entities who possessed the one thing the Necrontyre could never have: time. The jealousy that burned in Necrontyre hearts was all-consuming. Here were beings who could live for thousands of years, who mastered the webway and created servant races with gifts of psychic power, who shaped the galaxy to their whims, while the Necrontyre struggled just to survive into middle age. This envy became hatred, and hatred became war. The war in heaven shook the foundations of reality itself, pitting the Necrontyre against the Old Ones and their creations in a conflict that would reshape the galaxy forever. But the Necrontyre were losing. Their superior numbers and advanced technology no match for the Old Ones' mastery of the Imperium. and their ability to create new warrior races to fight on their behalf. It was in this moment of desperation that the C'tan appeared, or rather, were given form. These entities of living starlight, these star gods who had existed since the birth of the universe itself, offered the Necrontyr everything they had ever desired: immortality, power beyond measure, bodies that would never fail, never sicken, never age. All they had to do was undergo a process called biotransference, transferring their consciousness from fragile flesh into bodies of living metal called necrodermis. The Silent King, Zarek, leader of the Necrontyr people, made the decision that would doom his entire species. He agreed to the C'tan's terms. What followed was a nightmare of industrial scale. Vast biofurnaces were constructed across the Necrontyr worlds, massive facilities into which entire populations marched, believing they were walking toward salvation. The C'tan had not lied about the immortality they would receive, but they had omitted crucial details about the price. As each Necrontyr entered the furnaces, their flesh was consumed, their soul torn from them and devoured by the circling C'tan, who gorged themselves on the spiritual essence of an entire species. What emerged from the other side were the Necrons, beings of living metal who retained some echo of who they had been, but had lost the vital spark that made them truly alive. The Silent King was among the last to undergo biotransference, and when he emerged and looked upon what his people had become, he understood the magnitude of his error. His body was stronger than it had ever been, his mind sharper, his pain gone. But there was an emptiness inside him, a hollowness that no amount of power could fill. He had gained physical immortality at the cost of his soul. The Necrontyr were gone, and in their place stood the Necrons, soulless automata bound by command protocols that ensured their absolute loyalty to their leaders, unable to truly feel the horror of what had been done to them. The hierarchy that emerged from biotransference reflected the social structure of the old Necrontyr empire, but twisted by the limitations of their new forms. At the lowest levels were the Necron warriors, ordinary citizens who had retained almost nothing of their former personalities. They were little more than automatons, capable of following orders and executing tactics, but possessing no real individuality or independent thought. They could fight with terrifying efficiency, their Gauss weapons unmaking enemies at the molecular level, but they could not remember why they fought or what they had lost. Above them stood the Immortals, professional soldiers who had been granted slightly more advanced forms and retained marginally more of their original consciousness. They could make tactical decisions, adapt to changing battlefield conditions, and coordinate complex maneuvers, but they remained essentially mindless when compared to what they had once been. The true intelligence, such as it was, resided in the upper echelons of Necron society. The lords and overlords, nobles who had once ruled vast territories and commanded respect through lineage and accomplishment, retained the most of their former selves. They could still think strategically, still engage in the labyrinthine political machinations that had characterized Necrontyr society. They maintained codes of honor, held grudges that stretched back millions of years, and pursued ambitions that would take millennia to fulfill. Yet even they had lost something fundamental. Their emotions were muted, their capacity for joy or sorrow greatly diminished. They could remember what it felt like to laugh, but they could no longer truly experience laughter. They knew they had once loved, but the feeling itself was beyond their grasp. At the apex of the hierarchy stood the Pharaons, rulers of entire dynasties spanning multiple star systems. These were beings of immense power and, relatively speaking, preserved consciousness. They could plan centuries ahead, manipulate lesser species like pieces on a board, and wield technologies that defied the understanding of younger races. Yet, they too were hollowed out by biotransference, their grand ambitions driven more by ancient programming and the echoes of desires they no longer truly felt than by genuine passion. Alongside this military and political hierarchy existed the cryptex, the scientist priests of Necron society who had mastered technologies so advanced they appeared as sorcery to other species. These beings manipulated time, space, matter, and energy with casual ease, their understanding of the universe's fundamental forces beyond anything the Imperium's greatest tech priests could comprehend. They created weapons that could erase targets from existence, devices that could phase through solid matter, and constructs that repaired the fallen with ruthless efficiency. Yet for all their knowledge, they could not restore what biotransference had taken from them. The Necrons waged war against the Citan, who had deceived them, shattering the star gods into fragments and imprisoning these shards in tesseract labyrinths, dimensional prisons from which they could be unleashed as weapons when needed. But this victory brought them no closer to reclaiming what they had lost. The Necrons then entered what they called the Great Sleep, retreating to tomb worlds across the galaxy to hibernate for millions of years, waiting for a time when the galaxy might be ripe for reconquest, when their ancient enemies would be diminished, and they might find a way to reverse the curse of biotransference. For 60 million years, they slumbered in stasis crypts deep beneath the surfaces of countless worlds. Many of these tomb worlds suffered catastrophic failures during the long sleep. Cascade failures destroyed entire legions. Programming errors transformed sleeping nobles into something monstrous. Natural disasters and the shifting of planetary tectonics buried some tombs so deep they would never awaken. Others were discovered and looted by younger races who had no understanding of the danger they were unleashing. But many tomb worlds survived intact, their ancient technologies maintaining the sleeping Necrons through the rise and fall of entire civilizations on the surfaces above. The awakening, when it finally began in the closing years of the 41st Millennium, was not the unified revival the Silent King had envisioned. The command protocols that would have synchronized the awakening across all tomb worlds had been severed when Zarek deactivated them before departing into self-imposed exile. Each tomb world now awoke on its own schedule, triggered by various factors, disturbances from the surface, internal chronometers reaching their programmed endpoints, or random malfunctions in ancient systems that had run for millions of years without maintenance. The awakening process itself followed a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to ensure the tomb world's security before its most valuable inhabitants emerged from stasis. First came the canoptech constructs, artificial intelligences housed in bodies of living metal, designed for specific maintenance and defense functions. Scarabs, small beetle-like constructs, would swarm through the tomb complex, repairing damage accumulated over the millennia and consuming any intruders who had breached the outer defenses. Canoptech spiders, larger arachnid forms, would restore communication systems and manufacture additional scarabs as needed. Canoptech wraiths, serpentine constructs capable of phasing through solid matter, would hunt down any threats that had penetrated deep into the tomb. Once the constructs had secured the tomb and completed initial repairs, the awakening would proceed through the ranks in ascending order of importance. The warriors would be the first Necrons to emerge from stasis, their bodies checked and repaired by the Canoptech systems before they were activated. These mindless soldiers would form defensive perimeters and begin the process of clearing the tomb of any accumulated debris or organic growth. The Immortals would follow, taking command of the warrior formations and establishing proper military organization. Only after the lower ranks had been awakened and organized would the tomb mind, the artificial intelligence that governed the tomb complex, begin the revival of the lords and overlords. These higher-ranking Necrons required more careful awakening procedures, their more complex cognitive matrices taking longer to fully initialize. As each tier awakened, the tomb world would gradually transform from a sleeping mausoleum into a functioning military installation, ancient weapons systems coming online and vast war machines emerging from their storage bays. Finally, at the appointed time, the Pharaon or Overlord who ruled the tomb world would be awakened, and upon their full revival, the tomb mind would cede control to its creator. From that point forward, the tomb world's actions would depend entirely on the character and ambitions of its awakened ruler. Some pharaohs immediately launched campaigns of conquest, seeking to reclaim territories that had belonged to their dynasties millions of years ago. Others focused inward, rebuilding their tomb worlds to match the glory of ages past, avoiding unnecessary conflict with the younger races. Still others sent out diplomatic emissaries or search parties, seeking other tomb worlds of their dynasty or attempting to recover ancient artifacts and technologies scattered across the galaxy. It is in this context of awakening tomb worlds, of ancient beings stirring from millions of years of sleep, to find the galaxy utterly transformed, that we must consider the possibility of a human child coming into Necron custody. The circumstances that might lead to such an arrangement are varied, and each speaks to different aspects of Necron psychology and ambition. Understanding these possibilities helps us comprehend not just how you might come to be raised by Necrons, but why they might choose to keep you alive, and what purpose you might serve in their grand schemes. The most straightforward scenario, though perhaps the most disturbing, involves the conquest of a human world built unknowingly atop a Necron tomb. This happens with distressing frequency across the Imperium. Colonists arrive on what appears to be an uninhabited planet, perhaps a dead world with a thin atmosphere and minimal life, but rich in minerals or strategically positioned along trade routes. They establish settlements, dig deep mines, and build vast hive cities, never knowing that beneath their feet lie the sleeping legions of a tomb world that has waited in darkness for longer than their species has existed. When such a tomb awakens, the result is typically catastrophic for the human population. Necron warriors phase up through solid rock, emerging in the lower levels of hive cities or in the heart of mining complexes. Gauss weapons unmake human defenders at the molecular level, reducing flesh and bone to their component atoms. Monoliths, vast floating pyramids of living metal, appear in the skies above population centers, disgorging more warriors while their Gauss flux arcs incinerate entire city blocks. The Necrons show no mercy, because mercy is an emotion most of them can no longer feel. They are reclaiming what was always theirs, and the human infestation must be cleansed. But imagine, in the chaos of such a conquest, a Necron overlord discovering something unexpected. Perhaps a child, separated from their parents in the panic of the invasion, taking shelter in some forgotten corner of the underhive. Perhaps an infant, abandoned in the confusion, crying in the ruins of what was once their home. A younger race might show compassion, might take pity on such a helpless creature. The Necrons are not moved by pity, but they are capable of curiosity, and some among them retain enough of their former selves to find the situation intriguing. The Overlord might see in this child an opportunity for observation, a chance to study the younger races from their very beginning. They might wonder what would happen if a human were raised with no knowledge of the Imperium, no indoctrination into the Imperial creed, no exposure to the xenophobia that defines human culture in the 41st millennium. Would such a human develop differently? Would they be more rational, more useful, more capable of seeing the galaxy as the Necrons see it? The Overlord might view you as an experiment, no different from the countless other experiments cryptechs conduct on captured specimens, but one with potentially interesting long-term results. Alternatively, the acquisition might be more deliberate. Some Necron dynasties, particularly those who most regret biotransference and seek ways to reverse it, actively study biological species to understand the nature of organic life. They might raid human worlds not for conquest, but for specimens, taking individuals of various ages to examine how biological forms grow, develop, and age. In such a scenario, you might be selected specifically because you are young, because your developing biology and psychology offer more data than a fully mature adult would provide. The Nephrek dynasty, whose members bathe in the light of their crown world's trinary stars and seek to absorb their solar energies, are known to be particularly interested in reversing biotransference. For them, the study of organic life is not academic, but intensely personal. They look at species like humanity and see what they lost. the capacity for growth and change and genuine feeling that was stripped from them 60 million years ago. A human child, in their custody, would be a living reminder of what they once were, a test subject for theories about how consciousness might be transferred from necrodermis back into flesh, a prize whose value increases with every year it survives in their care. There is also the possibility of political calculation. The Necron dynasties are not unified. They engage in complex political machinations, form and break alliances, and compete for status and territory with all the subtlety and ruthlessness their ancient nobility once displayed when they were flesh and blood. A Necron overlord seeking to understand and potentially manipulate the Imperium might decide that raising a human from infancy offers unique advantages. Such a human would have complete loyalty, having known no other life. They would understand both human and Necron perspectives, making them potentially valuable as an intermediary or infiltrator. They would be a long-term investment in a game played across centuries. Some Necrons, particularly those driven mad by the long sleep or by the psychological toll of immortality, might keep a human child for reasons that make sense only to their fractured minds. Nemesor Zandrek, for instance, still believes himself to be flesh and blood, his damaged consciousness unable to accept the reality of biotransference. Such a Necron might take in a human child, believing it to be a young Necrontire, a member of their own species in need of guidance. The child would be raised with care that is simultaneously genuine and utterly divorced from reality, shaped by the delusions of a being who has lived too long and seen too much. Regardless of how you came to be in Necron custody, the reality of your early years would be profoundly alien. You would not be raised in warmth and comfort, surrounded by soft voices and gentle hands. You would be raised in the cold corridors of a tomb world, in vast halls of living metal that hummed with energies that predated your species, cared for by beings who could calculate your nutritional needs to the molecule but had forgotten what it meant to comfort a crying child. Your earliest memories would be of green light, the distinctive phosphorescent glow that emanates from Necron technology. This light would be your sun, your moon, your stars. It would illuminate your sleeping chambers and guide your steps through corridors that stretched beyond your sight. Where human children learn to associate warmth and brightness with safety, you would find comfort in the cold green glow that marked the presence of your caretakers and the systems that sustained your life. The physical environment of a tomb world is not designed for biological life. The Necrons have no need for breathable atmosphere, comfortable temperatures, or protection from radiation. A newly awakened tomb world is a hostile environment filled with hard vacuum, extreme temperatures, and energies that would kill an unprotected human in seconds. For you to survive, the Necrons would need to modify portions of their tomb complex, creating habitable zones where atmosphere could be maintained, temperature regulated, and harmful radiations shielded. These modifications would be carried out with typical Necron precision and efficiency, but they would lack any consideration for aesthetics or comfort beyond the strict requirements of keeping you alive. Your chambers would be perfect cubes or spheres, the most mathematically efficient shapes for containing atmosphere and regulating temperature. The walls would be smooth necrodermis, living metal that could reshape itself as needed, but offered no warmth to the touch. The lighting would be optimized for human vision, but calibrated to exact specifications, rather than creating any sense of ambience. Every element would be functional, nothing more. Your earliest caretakers would likely be canoptech constructs rather than Necrons themselves. These artificial intelligences, while advanced beyond anything the Mechanicus could create, lack even the limited emotional capacity of the higher-ranking Necrons. A canoptech scarab, reprogrammed to monitor your vital signs and alert higher systems if you required intervention, might hover near your cradle, its sensors constantly measuring your heart rate, breathing, and body temperature. If you cried, it would not soothe you with motion or sound, but it would analyze your distress and respond according to its programming, adjusting room temperature or humidity, or summoning whatever passed for medical assistance in the tomb. The challenge of feeding a human infant would present unique difficulties for beings who have not eaten in 60 million years. The Necrons would need to either maintain biological specimens to produce milk, synthesize appropriate nutrition from base elements, or acquire supplies from human sources. Given their technological sophistication, synthesis would likely be their preferred method. Cryptex would analyze human breast milk down to its molecular composition and reproduce it with perfect accuracy, creating sustenance that met every nutritional requirement while containing not one molecule of anything resembling love or care. As you grew from infant to toddler, you would begin to explore the limited world available to you. The habitable zones, created for your benefit, would expand as you became more mobile, but they would always be islands of biological viability within an ocean of hostile metal and ancient technology. You might have rooms to move through, corridors to explore, but they would all be fundamentally the same. No sunlight would ever touch your skin. No wind would ever disturb your hair. No rain would ever fall on your face. The only weather you would know would be the carefully controlled climate of your artificial environment. Language acquisition would follow patterns both familiar and utterly strange. Humans are hardwired to learn language from social interaction, from the back and forth of conversation and the emotional context of communication. You would have no human voices to learn from, no parents exchanging words of affection, no siblings arguing or playing. Instead, you would learn language from beings who communicated with perfect precision, but no real warmth. The Necrons would teach you Gothic, the common tongue of the Imperium, because it would be the most useful language for their purposes. But they would also teach you the ancient languages of the Necrontier, allowing you access to records and communications that span millions of years. A Necron lord assigned to your education might appear at scheduled intervals, speaking to you in perfectly enunciated Gothic, every word clear and distinct, every grammatical structure flawless. There would be no baby talk, no simplification for your young mind. You would learn language as you would learn mathematics, through precise instruction and repetition, absorbing vocabulary and syntax without the emotional coloring that makes language more than just a tool for conveying information. Your understanding of concepts like family, love, and belonging would be fundamentally warped by your environment. You would know theoretically that humans had parents and siblings, that they formed emotional bonds and cared for each other beyond simple mutual utility. But you would have no experiential framework for understanding these concepts. When a Necron lord told you that humans once lived in family units, you would catalogue that information alongside facts about Necron dynastic structures and Satan feeding habits, all filed away as abstract knowledge rather than anything you had personally felt. The question of physical affection would present particular challenges. Humans need touch, especially as infants and children. Studies from before the Age of Strife showed that human babies deprived of physical contact could develop severe psychological and even physical problems. The Necrons, having no such needs themselves and barely remembering that they once did, would struggle to understand this requirement. They might simulate it through technological means, creating fields of force that applied gentle pressure to simulate holding, or programming canoptech constructs to maintain physical contact during your sleep cycles. But these simulations, no matter how precisely calibrated to human physiological needs, would lack the warmth and spontaneity of genuine affection. You would learn to walk in corridors that never changed, to speak words that brought no emotional response, to sleep under lights that never truly darkened. Your world would be one of absolute predictability and total isolation. The Necrons around you would follow patterns that had been established millions of years ago, their actions governed by protocols and hierarchies that had been ancient when humanity's oldest ancestors were still swimming in primordial seas. You would be the only thing in your entire world that grew, that changed, that moved through developmental stages and became something different with each passing year. The psychological impact of such an upbringing would be profound and multifaceted. Humans are social creatures, evolved to live in groups, to read emotional cues, to form attachments and navigate complex social hierarchies. You would develop all the cognitive machinery for these social functions, but you would have nowhere to apply it. Your brain would wire itself to recognize and respond to emotional expressions, but the faces around you would be metal skulls incapable of expression. You would develop the capacity for empathy, but you would have no one to empathize with, no one whose feelings you could read and mirror. This disconnection between your evolved human nature and your Necron-shaped nurture would create a fundamental split in your identity. Part of you would be human, with human needs and human responses to the world. But another part, the part shaped by your environment and experience, would be something altogether different, something that had no name, because nothing like you had ever existed before. You would not be human as the Imperium understands humanity, nor would you be Necron, but something caught between these states, able to fully belong to neither. As you progressed beyond early childhood and into what humans would consider school age, your education would begin in earnest. The Necrons, having determined to raise you, would do so with the same precision and thoroughness they applied to everything else. Your curriculum would be designed not by pedagogical specialists who understood child development, but by beings who had mastered sciences that made imperial knowledge look primitive by comparison. They would teach you everything they deemed useful, caring nothing for whether the material was appropriate for your age or developmental stage. Mathematics would come first, because to the Necrons, mathematics underlies all of reality. You would learn arithmetic not through games or manipulatives, but through direct instruction in number theory and set logic. By the time human children would be learning to add and subtract, you would be working with multidimensional calculations and quantum probability matrices. The Necrons would see no reason to slow down for your biological limitations. Your brain was plastic enough to adapt, and adapt it would, forming neural pathways that humans raised in the Imperium would never develop. Physics would follow, and not the simplified versions taught in Imperial Schola. You would learn about the fundamental forces of the universe, from beings who could manipulate those forces at will. Cryptex would demonstrate concepts by causing matter to phase shift, by bending light around objects, by manipulating local gravity fields. Where human students might struggle to understand abstract concepts, you would see them made manifest, watching as space itself curved in response to carefully controlled applications of ancient technology. The Necrons would also teach you their history, though their perspective on that history would be radically different from anything the Imperium might record. You would learn about the Necrontyr, their short lives and their great works, their endless wars and their final desperate bargain. You would hear about biotransference not as a triumph, but as a tragedy, would understand the depth of what the Necrons had lost when they traded flesh for metal. The being teaching you these things might speak with the clinical detachment of a historian, but you might catch glimpses of something deeper, some echo of genuine emotion when discussing what it meant to lose one's soul. You would learn about the war in heaven, that ancient conflict that reshaped reality itself, not from fragmentary imperial records or Eldari legends, but from beings who had fought in it. Your tutors would describe battles that lasted for centuries, strategies that played out across multiple star systems, weapons that could unmake planets with a single shot. They would speak of the old ones with a hatred that had not dimmed despite 60 million years of sleep, would describe the creation of the Eldari and other servant races, with contempt for beings born to serve rather than to rule. The Satan would feature prominently in your lessons, and here your tutor's feelings would be complex and contradictory. Hatred for the star gods who deceived the Necrontyr, certainly, but also a kind of terrible respect for beings who had existed since the dawn of creation. You would learn how the Satan were given physical form, how they fed on the life essence of the Necrontyr during biotransference, how they were eventually shattered and imprisoned. You would be shown tesseract labyrinths, those dimensional prisons containing Satan shards, and you would understand that these fragments of godlike beings were now used as weapons by their former servants. Your education would also include extensive instruction in Necron technology, because knowledge was power, and the Necrons would want you to understand the capabilities at their disposal. You would learn how Gauss weapons functioned, stripping away atoms layer by layer until nothing remained. You would study the principles behind resurrection protocols, the systems that allowed destroyed Necrons to be rebuilt and reactivated. You would understand phase shift technology, quantum encryption, and energy projection systems that could crack planets. But perhaps most importantly, you would be taught about the Necron dynasties and their complex political structures. This knowledge would be essential for your survival, because navigating Necron society without understanding its hierarchies and protocols would be like walking through a minefield blindfolded. You would learn to recognize the different ranks by their physical forms and the honors they displayed. You would understand that a Necron Lord's commands were absolute within their domain, but that an Overlord's word superseded all lesser nobles. You would know that pharaohs ruled dynasties, and that their authority extended across multiple tomb worlds. The codes of honor that governed interactions between Necron nobles would be drilled into you with particular emphasis. These codes, remnants of Necrontier culture that survived biotransference, dictated everything from formal address to the circumstances under which conflict could be initiated. Breaking these codes, even inadvertently, could result in consequences ranging from loss of status to outright destruction. As a human under Necron protection, you would occupy an ambiguous position in this hierarchy, and understanding the nuances of Necron honor would be essential for maintaining that protection. You would learn to identify the different Necron forces by their appearance and function. The mindless warriors, marching in perfect formation, were the foundation of any Necron legion. The immortals, slightly more autonomous, served as sergeants and specialists. The Lich Guard, elite warriors who served as bodyguards to the nobility, were to be approached with particular caution, as they were programmed to eliminate threats to their masters with ruthless efficiency. Deathmarks, phase-capable assassins who could strike from alternate dimensions, were creatures even other Necrons viewed with unease. The Destroyer cult would be presented to you as a warning, an example of what happens when Necrons lose themselves entirely to their mechanical nature. These beings had modified themselves beyond all recognition, replacing limbs with weapons and excising any remaining traces of their former personalities. They existed only to kill, and they did so with terrifying efficiency. Other Necrons viewed them with something approaching fear, worried that whatever madness afflicted destroyers might be contagious, that they too might one day succumb to the urge to embrace the machine completely and abandon the last vestiges of who they had been. You would also learn about the Flayed Ones, though this knowledge would come with warnings. These Necrons, cursed by the dying Satan Yandugor, had devolved into savage creatures who wore the skins of their victims and seemed to hunger for flesh, despite having no capacity to digest it. They dwelt in a pocket dimension known as the Bone Kingdom of Drazak, emerging whenever they sensed carnage to join in the slaughter. Even other Necrons found Flayed Ones disturbing. These reminders of what biotransference could ultimately reduce them to. Your understanding of the cryptex would be more nuanced, as these would likely be the Necrons you interacted with most frequently in your education. Cryptex were specialists, masters of various technological disciplines that they had perfected over millions of years. A chronomancer could manipulate the flow of time, causing enemy units to age centuries in seconds, or trapping them in temporal loops. A psychomancer wielded technologies that affected the minds of biological beings, projecting fear, confusion, or pain directly into their consciousness. A plasmancer controlled stellar energies, channeling the power of suns through their technological mastery. These beings would view you with something closer to scientific interest than anything resembling affection. You would be a data point, a variable in their ongoing experiments, but also a potential student who could be taught to understand concepts that most biological beings could never grasp. A chronomancer might demonstrate temporal manipulation for you, slowing time around your hand so you could watch a falling object hover motionless in the air. A plasmancer might create miniature suns for your examination, balls of fusing hydrogen contained in stasis fields, explaining the nuclear processes that powered stars with the casual expertise of beings who had mastered such forces when your species was still learning to make fire. Your daily life would be structured with the kind of rigid precision that only beings who never sleep and never tire could maintain. You would rise at the same time each day, the lighting in your chambers brightening to simulate sunrise, even though you had never seen the actual sun. A canoptech construct would appear to guide you through morning routines, ensuring you attended to biological necessities that the Necrons themselves had not needed to consider for millions of years. Meals would be delivered with exact punctuality, nutritionally perfect synthetic foods that met every dietary requirement but offered no variety or pleasure. The Necrons would see no reason to make food interesting or appealing. It was fuel for your biological processes, nothing more. If you expressed preference for certain foods or complained about the monotony, they might adjust the molecular structure to create different textures or flavors, but always from a place of clinical problem solving rather than any desire to please you. Your education would consume most of your waking hours, but there would be time allocated for what the Necrons understood to be necessary for human development. Physical exercise, for instance, would be scheduled and supervised. A lich guard might be assigned to ensure you completed regimens designed to maintain optimal health and physical conditioning. These exercises would not be games or play, but precisely calibrated activities designed to stress your muscles and cardiovascular system in exact measure. You might be given access to a training area where you could practice movement and coordination, but this would not be a playground. It would be a perfectly geometric space with equipment designed to push your physical capabilities to their limits. Gravity might be adjusted to simulate higher or lower planetary conditions. Atmospheric pressure and composition might be varied to force your body to adapt. Every session would be monitored and measured, data collected on your performance and used to adjust future training protocols. Social interaction would be your greatest deprivation. Humans need connection with other humans, need to see themselves reflected in others, and learn about their own humanity through social exchange. You would have none of this. Your only companions would be Necrons and canoptech constructs, beings fundamentally incapable of meeting your social needs. You might develop parasocial attachments to particular Necrons, might feel something approaching affection for a cryptech who taught you, or a lord who spoke to you more frequently than others. But these feelings would be entirely one-sided. Your human need for connection projecting itself onto beings incapable of reciprocating. The Necrons, for their part, would observe your social behaviors with interest but little understanding. If you tried to engage them in what you understood to be conversation, asking about their preferences or experiences, they might respond with confusion. Preferences implied feelings, and most Necrons had no real feelings left. Experiences spanning millions of years blurred together into an undifferentiated mass of time. A Necron lord might have fought in 1,000 battles, but they might not be able to tell you which ones they enjoyed or feared or found meaningful, because those emotional contexts had been stripped away, along with their souls. You would likely develop coping mechanisms for the profound isolation of your existence. You might talk to yourself, creating imaginary conversations to fill the silence. You might anthropomorphize the canoptech constructs that attended you, giving them names and personalities, even though they were no more sentient than any other machine. You might create elaborate fantasy worlds in your mind, stories of other humans you had never met, families you would never join, experiences you would never have. The Necrons would observe these behaviors with the detachment of scientists noting the responses of a laboratory animal. They might record your self-talk and analyze it for patterns. They might note your tendency to assign personality to non-sentient constructs and file it away as an example of human cognitive bias. They would not intervene to provide actual social interaction because they would not understand why you needed it or how devastating its absence was to your psychological development. As you grew older and your cognitive abilities developed, you would begin to understand the true nature of your situation. You would realize that you were unique, possibly the only human in the entire galaxy being raised by Necrons. This realization would bring with it a profound sense of existential loneliness. You were not just isolated from other humans, you were isolated from the entire concept of humanity, raised in a context so alien that even if you someday encountered other humans, you might find yourself unable to truly connect with them. You would also begin to understand what the Necrons had lost through biotransference, and this understanding would shape your perception of your caretakers in complex ways. They would no longer simply be the beings who raised you, but tragic figures, cursed immortals, who had traded everything that made life worth living for an existence that could not properly be called life at all. You might feel something like pity for them, even as you recognize that they were incapable of feeling pity for themselves or for you. The purpose the Necrons had in raising you would become clearer as you matured. If you were being groomed as a potential intermediary with the Imperium, you would begin training in deception and negotiation, learning to present yourself as human while actually serving Necron interests. If you were primarily a research subject for their studies on organic life and biotransference, you might find yourself subjected to increasingly invasive examinations and tests. If you were the project of a mad noble who saw you as a replacement for lost family, you might find yourself expected to play roles in elaborate delusions that made sense only to a mind damaged by millions of years of existence. Regardless of the specific purpose, you would come to understand that you existed to serve Necron interests, that your life had value only insofar as it advanced their goals. This would be made clear not through cruelty, but through the same clinical honesty that characterized all Necron communication. When you asked why they had raised you, they would tell you exactly why, would explain your function with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to explain stellar mechanics or quantum field theory. Your adolescence would bring new challenges as your body began to change in ways the Necrons had no personal memory of experiencing. Biological maturation would be something they understood only theoretically from their studies of organic species and from ancient records of Necron-tire biology. They would provide you with information about the changes you were experiencing, but again, this would be presented as pure data with no emotional context or reassurance. The Necrons would be particularly interested in this phase of your development because it represented something they could no longer experience: genuine change and growth. A Necron's consciousness might shift over millions of years, might be damaged by repeated destruction and resurrection, but they did not develop or mature in any biological sense. Watching you transform from child to adolescent to adult would be observing a process they had lost access to so long ago that most had forgotten it entirely. If the Necrons' ultimate goal involved using you to infiltrate Imperial society or otherwise interact with humanity, your adolescence would mark the beginning of intensive training in how to pass as a normal human. This would present unique challenges because you would need to learn behaviors and social norms you had never experienced firsthand. A Necron cryptech might show you recordings of human interaction captured from conquered worlds, might have you study the way humans moved and spoke and related to each other, trying to teach you to mimic something you had never authentically experienced. You would learn about the Imperium of man, not as a citizen, but as an outsider studying an alien culture. The God Emperor would be presented to you as a powerful psyker who had attempted to unite humanity during a period of galactic upheaval. The Imperial Creed would be explained as a control mechanism, a way to ensure the loyalty of trillions of humans across vast distances. You would understand the structure of Imperial society, from the lowest hive worker to the high lords of terror, not from a position within that society, but from the detached perspective of someone analyzing a xenoculture. The Necrons would teach you about the other major factions of the 41st millennium as well. The Eldari, those ancient remnants of the Old One's servant races, would be described with particular contempt. The Necrons remembered the Eldari's creators and bore grudges that stretched back to the war in heaven. They would explain how the Eldari's hedonism had birthed a chaos god and shattered their empire, would note with something approaching satisfaction that the proud Eldari were now reduced to scattered craft worlds and the debased Drukhari hiding in the webway. The Orcs would be dismissed as a corrupted version of the Krork, another Old One's creation that had degenerated over the millennia. The Tau, newcomers to the galactic stage, would barely register as worthy of discussion. The Tyranids, however, would be treated as a serious threat, an extragalactic menace that consumed biological matter on a scale that even the Necrons found concerning. And Chaos, the entities of the warp and their mortal servants, would be described with a special kind of revulsion. The Necrons had no souls, and thus no connection to the warp, viewing it as a realm of irrational chaos that stood in opposition to everything they valued about order and logic. Your own position regarding these factions would be complicated. You were human, so theoretically you shared kinship with the Imperium, but you had been raised by their enemies and taught to see the Imperium through Necron eyes. You were biological, which aligned you more with the Tyranids than with your Necron caretakers in some fundamental ways, but you had been shaped by Necron culture and education. You existed in a space between categories, unable to truly belong to any faction, yet touched by multiple perspectives. As you reached physical maturity, the question of what came next would loom large. You had been raised and educated, shaped into something unique in the galaxy. But to what end? The Necrons did not act without purpose, even when that purpose was driven by the delusions of damaged minds. Whatever they had planned for you, whatever role they intended you to fill, would now begin to manifest in concrete ways. If you were to serve as an infiltrator or agent within the Imperium, you would need to be inserted into human society in a believable way. This would require careful planning and preparation. A false identity would need to be constructed, a backstory that could withstand scrutiny. You might be placed on a frontier world, appearing as a survivor of some disaster that conveniently left no other witnesses. You might be inserted into a hive city's underbelly, where questions about your origins would be less likely to arise. The Necrons would have accessed Imperial databases, would know how the administratum functioned and what kinds of records were kept, and would craft your false identity accordingly. Your role once inserted would depend on what intelligence the Necrons sought. You might be tasked with monitoring Imperial military movements, reporting on the positions of fleets and armies. You might be planted near sites the Necrons suspected held their ancient artifacts, ready to facilitate recovery operations when the time came. You might be positioned to eventually rise in Imperial society, playing a very long game that would take decades to pay off, but which the Necrons, who thought in terms of millennia, would consider a perfectly reasonable time frame. The psychological strain of such a mission would be immense. You would need to constantly maintain a facade of normalcy, to pretend to be something you had never authentically been. Every interaction would require careful thought. Every relationship would be based on deception. You would live among humans but never truly be one of them, would participate in their society while secretly serving their ancient enemies. And you would do this knowing that the Necrons who raised you felt nothing that could be called loyalty or affection, that you were simply a tool they had spent resources developing and now expected to provide returns on that investment. Alternatively, if your primary value to the Necrons was as a research subject for their biotransference experiments, your adult life might be spent in increasingly invasive studies. The Nephrek dynasty or other Necrons seeking to reverse their transformation would be intensely interested in how your consciousness operated within its biological substrate. They might conduct neural mapping of unprecedented detail, might study how your brain processed information and generated what appeared to be genuine emotion and consciousness. These experiments would push the boundaries of what you could endure. They would want to understand not just how your brain functioned normally, but how it responded to damage, to alteration, to integration with their technologies. They might attempt to interface your consciousness directly with Necron systems, to see if organic minds could control their technologies in ways that might inform their attempts to transfer Necron consciousness back into biological forms. You would be vivisected not with crude surgical tools, but with technologies capable of examining individual neurons without damaging surrounding tissue, would be studied with a thoroughness that would provide answers the Necrons desperately sought, but which would come at terrible cost to your well-being. There is also the possibility that you might be displayed, a curiosity in some Necron noble's collection. Trazyn the Infinite, that most eccentric of Necron overlords, maintains vast galleries filled with specimens from across the galaxy and throughout history. He has collected everything from Astartes to enslavers, preserving them in stasis fields for his personal study and satisfaction. A human raised entirely by Necrons would be exactly the kind of unique specimen that would interest someone like Trazyn, a one-of-a-kind example of cultural intersection that had never occurred before and might never occur again. In such a scenario, you might find yourself in a stasis field, frozen in time, perfectly preserved alongside thousands of other specimens. You would be aware, able to see and hear, but unable to move or speak or age, trapped in a single moment that would last forever. Trazyn might occasionally reactivate you to ask questions or to show you off to other collectors, might use you to demonstrate points in academic discussions with other Necrons about the nature of consciousness or the possibilities of cross-species cultural transmission. But mostly you would simply exist, a living exhibit in a museum that stretched across multiple worlds. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that you might have no grand purpose at all, that you were raised on the whim of a Necron whose consciousness had fractured during the long sleep. Nemesor Zandrek, who believes himself still flesh and blood and hosts silent banquets aboard his flagship, represents an extreme example of this kind of madness. But many Necrons suffer from less dramatic delusions. One might have raised you believing you were their child, their mind unable to accept that they could no longer reproduce. Another might have developed an obsessive interest in biological life as a coping mechanism for the emptiness of their existence, collecting and studying organic beings the way others might collect coins or stamps. In such cases, your adult life would be shaped by the particular delusions of your caretaker. You might be expected to participate in elaborate charades, to play roles in scenarios that made sense only within the framework of a damaged consciousness. You would be simultaneously precious and meaningless, valued for what you represented to a broken mind, but lacking any real agency or purpose beyond serving as a prop in someone else's delusion. Regardless of which path your life took, you would eventually be exposed to the broader galaxy and forced to confront what you had become. If you were sent to infiltrate the Imperium, you would encounter humans living normal human lives, would see families and friendships, and all the messy, emotional connections that had been absent from your own childhood. If you were displayed in Trazyn's galleries, you would see other species living their lives before being captured and frozen, would understand that they had experienced authenticity in ways you never had. If you remained with the Necrons as their research subject or ward, you would witness their interactions with other species and understand the fundamental alienness of your upbringing. This confrontation with the wider galaxy would force you to grapple with questions of identity that had no easy answers. Were you human? Genetically, yes, but culturally, no. You would have human DNA and human biology, but your thoughts would be shaped by Necron logic and Necron values. You would be capable of human emotions, but you would have learned to suppress or redirect them because expressing emotion around beings incapable of reciprocating was simply painful. You would have human needs for connection and belonging, but you would have learned to function without those needs being met, would have adapted to isolation in ways that left you fundamentally changed. Were you Necron? Certainly not in any physical sense. You were flesh where they were metal, warm where they were cold, mortal where they were deathless. But you thought like them in many ways. You approached problems with the systematic logic they had drilled into you. You viewed the galaxy through frameworks they had provided. You understood their culture and values in ways no other human could. You were more Necron in your psychology than many actual Necrons, who had lost so much of their original consciousness that they functioned on pure programming. The truth was that you were neither human nor Necron, but something unique and unprecedented. You were a human consciousness shaped by Necron culture, a biological being raised in a mechanical context, a mortal mind trained in immortal perspectives. There was no word for what you were because nothing like you had ever existed before. You were the intersection of two species that should never have intersected in this way, a singular individual whose very existence asked questions about nature and nurture that philosophers could debate for centuries. The isolation of this realization would be crushing. You could not return to humanity because you had never been part of it to begin with. You could not remain with the Necrons because you would never truly be one of them, would always be separate and other. You existed in a liminal space, belonging nowhere, understood by no one. Even if you met other humans, even if you tried to explain your experiences, how could they possibly comprehend what it meant to be raised by the deathless machines of a fallen empire? To learn love was a concept from beings incapable of feeling it. To grow up in the cold green light of tomb worlds that predated your species by millions of years. Your perspective on the Necrons themselves would be complex and nuanced in ways that outside observers could never match. You would understand them not as the terrifying alien threat the Imperium perceived, but as tragic figures trapped in an existence they had chosen but now could not escape. You would know individual Necrons, would have spent enough time around them to recognize their different personalities despite their emotional limitations. You would understand that the overlord who ordered atrocities against conquered populations might have been, millions of years ago, a beloved leader who genuinely cared for their people. You would know that the cryptech conducting painful experiments was searching desperately for a way to undo the curse of biotransference, not out of cruelty, but because they dimly remembered what it felt like to be alive and wanted that feeling back. This understanding would not excuse the Necrons' actions, but it would complicate your feelings about them in ways that clear moral judgments could not accommodate. They were monsters who had committed genocides and harvested entire populations. They were also victims of a deception that had cost them everything that made existence meaningful. They were your enemies, the enemies of your species. They were also your family, the only beings who had raised you and shaped you, however imperfectly. You would also understand the Imperium differently than any loyal servant of the Emperor could. You would see the Imperial Creed not as divine truth, but as mythology designed to control and motivate vast populations. You would recognize the inefficiencies and cruelties of Imperial bureaucracy, the way human potential was squandered in service to a corpse god who might never have wanted to be worshipped. You would understand that the Imperium's xenophobia, while perhaps necessary for survival in a hostile galaxy, also blinded it to possibilities and opportunities, condemned potentially useful allies to destruction, and prevented any real understanding between species. But you would also see why the Imperium functioned as it did, why its ruthless pragmatism and rigid hierarchies were perhaps the only way to hold together a realm spanning 1,000,000 worlds. You would understand that the Emperor, whatever he had or had not become, had built something that endured for 10,000 years in a galaxy that actively resisted order and unity. You would recognize that Imperial faith, for all its irrationality from a Necron perspective, provided meaning and purpose to billions of humans who would otherwise be crushed by the sheer grinding horror of existence in the 41st millennium. Your views on other species would be similarly nuanced. The Aeldari, whom the Necrons hated with ancient passion, you might see as beings trapped by their own history, unable to move forward because they were haunted by what they had been. The Orcs, whom the Necrons dismissed as degenerate creatures, you might recognize as having something the Necrons had lost. genuine joy in existence, the ability to find satisfaction in the present moment, rather than being haunted by the past or obsessed with an uncertain future. Even the Tyranids, usually seen as mindless devourers, you might understand as perfectly adapted to their purpose, free from the existential questions that plagued consciousness in ways that biotransference had perhaps never quite destroyed. The question of what you would do with your knowledge and unique perspective would define the later stages of your life. If you chose to serve the Necrons loyally, you would become their most effective agent among the younger races, able to navigate human or other biological societies with an understanding no purely mechanical being could match. You would betray humanity not out of malice, but because you genuinely believed the Necrons represented a better future, or at least a more honest one than the Imperium's lies and superstitions. If you chose to rebel, to use your knowledge to warn the Imperium or otherwise work against your Necron creators, you would become one of the most dangerous enemies the Necrons had ever faced. You would know their weaknesses, their political divisions, their technological capabilities and limitations. You would understand how they thought and could anticipate their strategies, but you would also be hunted with the relentless efficiency that only immortal beings with unlimited patience could bring to bear. The Necrons would not forgive betrayal, would pursue you across the galaxy until you were found and brought to whatever passed for justice in their society. More likely, you might try to chart a middle course, serving neither the Necrons nor the Imperium exclusively, but trying to survive as an independent agent in a galaxy that had no place for such independence. You might become a rogue trader of sorts, operating in the margins and interstices of Imperial society, using your unique knowledge for personal gain while trying to avoid the attention of both the Necrons, who raised you, and the Imperium, that would see you as tainted by Xenos contact. This path would be lonely and dangerous, but it would at least be yours, a choice made by your own will rather than imposed by others. The broader implications of your existence would extend far beyond your personal story. A human successfully raised by Necrons would prove several things that various factions would find either encouraging or deeply troubling. It would demonstrate that Necrons were capable of long-term planning involving biological species, suggesting they might be pursuing agendas more complex than simple conquest. It would show that human minds could be shaped to accept and even embrace Xenos perspectives, undermining the Imperium's certainty about humanity's natural superiority and the necessity of xenophobia. For the Necrons themselves, success in raising a human would provide valuable data for their biotransference research. If a biological consciousness could be shaped to think in Necron patterns, perhaps the process could be reversed. Perhaps Necron consciousness could be successfully transferred into biological substrates. This hope, however slim, would drive continued experimentation, might lead to more humans being taken and raised in similar conditions, each one a test subject in the Necrons' desperate quest to undo their ancient curse. The Imperium, if it ever learned of your existence, would face a doctrinal crisis. How should they classify you? You were genetically human, but you had been irredeemably tainted by Xenos contact from your earliest moments. The most hardline elements would argue for immediate execution, that you were too dangerous to live, too corrupted to ever be trusted. More pragmatic voices might see value in your knowledge, might want to extract everything you knew about the Necrons before disposing of you. The most radical might even suggest attempting to rehabilitate you, to reclaim you for humanity, though they would quickly realize that there was no human baseline to return you to, that you had never been properly human to begin with. The Inquisition would take particular interest in you. Ordo Xenos would want to study you as a source of intelligence about the Necrons. Radical elements within the Inquisition might see you as a test case for whether humans and Xenos could truly coexist, whether the Imperium's absolute xenophobia was necessary, or whether more nuanced approaches might be possible. Others would see you as an abomination that proved the necessity of the Imperium's rigid doctrines, would use you as an example of what happened when humans were exposed to Xenos influence, without the protection of proper imperial conditioning. Other species would react to your existence in ways reflecting their own values and concerns. The Eldari, with their long memories and complex understanding of fate, might see you as a thread in a larger web, a small element in patterns they perceived but could not fully articulate. The Tau, with their philosophy of the greater good and openness to incorporating other species, might view you with interest as an example of successful cultural integration across species lines, though they would probably overlook the coercive nature of that integration. The Orcs would not care, and the Tyranids could not comprehend the concept. But among the intelligent spacefaring species, you would represent a unique data point in ongoing debates about the nature of consciousness, culture, and identity. Looking at the cold mathematics of your existence, the cost-benefit analysis that beings like the Necrons would inevitably conduct, what value would you actually provide that justified the resources invested in raising you? Maintaining habitable environments, synthesizing appropriate nutrition, dedicating time and attention to your education and development, all of this would represent a non-trivial expenditure of resources for beings who could otherwise focus entirely on reclaiming their ancient empire. The answer would depend on what the Necrons ultimately achieved through you. If you successfully infiltrated the Imperium and provided intelligence that allowed the Necrons to avoid costly conflicts or identify valuable targets, you might be deemed a worthwhile investment. If your biology provided insights that advanced biotransference research even marginally, the Necrons might consider you invaluable. If you simply satisfied the delusions or curiosities of a powerful noble, your value would be entirely subjective, meaningful only within the framework of that noble's fractured consciousness. But from your perspective, the question would not be about value or cost-benefit analysis. It would be about meaning and purpose in an existence that had been defined by forces beyond your control from its very beginning. You would need to find some way to make sense of who and what you were, to construct an identity that could reconcile your human biology with your Necron upbringing, to answer for yourself the question that would haunt you every day: what am I? In the final analysis, being raised by Necrons would be an existence defined by contradictions and paradoxes. You would be biologically alive but culturally aligned with the deathless. You would be capable of emotions but trained to suppress them. You would need connection but be isolated. You would be young in a place where everything else was ancient beyond measure. You would change and grow in an environment that never changed, that had been fundamentally the same for 60 million years. The tragedy of your existence would not be dramatic or violent. It would be the quiet tragedy of potential unfulfilled, of human warmth frozen in metal cold, of a consciousness that could have been anything but, was instead shaped into something singular and strange. You would live your life in the spaces between categories, never fully belonging anywhere, understood by none, and understanding everything perhaps too well. You would carry within you the possibility of bridge between species that had been enemies since before humanity left its cradle world. But that bridge would be painful and lonely, constructed from your own isolation and alienation. You would embody both the Necrons' greatest hope, that biotransference might somehow be undone, and their greatest tragedy, that they could observe and study life without being able to truly live it themselves. And perhaps, in the depths of the tomb world, that was your home. In the quiet moments between lessons and duties, you would look up at the metal ceiling that was your sky and wonder what the real stars looked like, what it felt like to stand under a sun that wasn't filtered through ancient technologies, what it meant to be among your own kind, to be truly home. These thoughts would bring you no comfort, because you would know with absolute certainty that you could never have these things, that home was a concept that applied to everyone except you, that you were and would always be alone in ways that beings with normal childhoods could never comprehend. This is what it would mean to be a human raised by Necrons, not an adventure, not a tale of triumph or tragedy in the conventional sense, but an existence so fundamentally alien that describing it requires understanding both what humanity is and what the Necrons have lost. You would stand as a monument to possibility and impossibility, to the question of whether consciousness can transcend its origins, or whether we are forever shaped by the contexts that form us. You would be living proof that biology is not destiny, but also that nurture without nature leaves something incomplete, something yearning for connections it can name but never truly experience. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, you would be something unprecedented. Not a warrior, though you might be trained for combat. Not a scholar, though you would possess knowledge few others could claim. Not quite human, and certainly not Necron, but something caught between, a consciousness that existed in the margins and interstices of a galaxy that had no proper category for what you were. And in that strange, liminal existence, you would carry within you questions that philosophers had debated for millennia, questions about identity and consciousness and what it truly means to be alive, to be human, to be anything at all in a universe that seemed designed to grind such questions into meaningless dust. The Necrons would observe you, study you, use you, perhaps even in their own limited way appreciate you. But they would never truly understand you, because understanding would require empathy they no longer possessed, would require them to remember not just intellectually, but emotionally what it meant to grow and change and need connection with others. And you would observe them, study them, perhaps even in your own way, care for them. But you would never be one of them, because for all their technology and power and ancient knowledge, they could not give you what you needed most, the simple human warmth of being among your own kind, of being seen and known and accepted as you were. This would be your existence. This would be your story. A tale told in cold green light, in corridors of living metal, in the silence of beings who remembered when the galaxy was young, but could not remember what it felt like to laugh. A story of one human consciousness, shaped by inhuman forces, trying to find meaning in an existence that had none of the reference points that make human life comprehensible. A life lived in the margins of the galaxy's great conflicts, significant to a few, invisible to most, understood by none. And so we close this meditation on what cannot be, on an existence too strange to truly exist, but compelling enough to imagine. Whether such a thing could actually occur in the grim darkness of the far future is perhaps less important than what thinking about it reveals about both humanity and the Necrons. It shows us that humanity is not simply biology, but culture and connection, that we are shaped as much by who raises us as by what we are born as. And it shows us that the Necrons, for all their mechanical nature and emotional limitation, are still bound by their past, still reaching towards something they lost and can never quite reclaim, still haunted by the memory of what it meant to be alive. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into one of the strangest possibilities in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more content exploring the dark corners and unusual implications of the 41st millennium. And leave a comment telling us what other unusual perspectives or scenarios you'd like us to explore. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is vast and contains multitudes of stories waiting to be told, and we're here to tell them, one strange possibility at a time. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there are also countless untold stories in the shadows between the battles. And those stories might be the most fascinating of all.